NATO marks the end of its combat mission in Afghanistan. But with the Taliban declaring the defeat of the US and its allies, what has the 13-year war achieved? What does the future hold for a country still racked by violence? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zaidan. Well, NATO has formally ended its 13-year combat mission in Afghanistan. International troops were sent in following the September 11th attacks in 2001. Well, their mission was to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda and to remove from power the Taliban. But questions remain over whether the US-led alliance has achieved all of its objectives and whether Afghanistan is ready to take charge of its own security. Well, NATO's presence came to a formal end with a flag-lowering ceremony in the capital, Kabul. The handover was held at an undisclosed location because of the threat posed by the Taliban. Afghan forces will take responsibility for security on the 1st of January. Now, 13,000 mainly US troops will remain in Afghanistan for 2 years in a training and advisory role, we're told. But the US will still conduct counter-terrorism operations there. And it's been reported President Barack Obama recently authorized the continuation of some US combat operations in 2015. Let's get the thoughts of our guests. In Kabul, we have Haroon Mir, founder of Afghanistan's Center for Research and Policy Studies. Joining us from Washington, D.C., Mark Kimmitt, a former Brigadier General and U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs. And also in Kabul is Helena Malikyar, an Afghan historian and political analyst. Let's start with Haroon. 2014, it's been a rough year for Afghan security forces in terms of casualties, hasn't it? Do you think they'll be up to the job of keeping the country secure and safe in 2015?
Well, indeed, 2015 will be a big test for the security transition in Afghanistan. Do
you think they'll pass the test?
The Taliban certainly will. It will be a big test. The Taliban will certainly intensify their fightings. Their military operation will certainly extend to the entire country. And we might expect a Taliban surge as of the beginning of next spring. However, the Afghan security forces have taken responsibility since 2012. Actually, the process of security transition has started in 2012. And since 2012, the Afghan security forces have been fighting in a number of provinces alone without the support of coalition forces in Afghanistan. And they have been capable of holding ground against the Taliban. And particularly, they were able to secure the important elections, presidential election in Afghanistan. And in that test, they came, I believe, victorious. And Taliban had attacked during the past spring, and particularly in summer and during the election time, in 16 provinces. And so why we have a very high number of casualties among Afghan security forces, because they were fighting in different fronts, and as well as they were heavy suicide and roadside attacks against Afghan security forces. And we are hopeful that they will be able to withstand the Taliban offensive, which will start, I believe, in the beginning of the spring in 2015.
All right, Mark Kimmitt, when Haroon talks about, the need for the Afghan security forces to hold their ground, will they be able to withstand? What's expected from them is to do even better in 2015 without the help of international forces in regular combat operations. Is that expecting too much?
Time will tell. I agree with your earlier guest that it is time for the Afghan security forces to take full responsibility for the vast majority of combat operations on the ground. But I think it's very important that we get the terminology right. Even though we announced the end of the combat mission in the last few days, what we're actually seeing is a complete transition over to Afghan lead. The Americans are not leaving, NATO is not leaving, there'll be fewer numbers there, but unlike Iraq in 2011, where all the troops departed, there will still be a substantial number of American advisors, counterterrorism experts, and frankly, American and NATO support that will be there for some period of time, so that when the Afghan forces are in fact fighting and taking the predominant lead, there will still be NATO support remaining inside the country for some period of time, I hope.
I'm glad you've opened that subject, Mark, and we're going to come to it in more detail in a minute. But first, let me remind our viewers what the Taliban is saying about this. And as we mentioned earlier, well, they're saying the end of NATO's combat mission is a victory, they're calling it. Spokesperson Zabihullah Mujahid said the NATO withdrawal was a clear indication of their defeat. He goes on to say that the US-led alliance had rolled up its flag in an atmosphere of failure and disappointment without having achieved anything substantial or tangible. Now, Helena, did the surge by US forces authorized by the US President Barack Obama, did it succeed? If casualties were rising this year amongst Afghan security forces, the Taliban still active, and peace talks, they don't seem to have made any progress.
I think the surge helped a lot, and that's why the Taliban changed their tactics. But then the earlier announcement that the US and NATO forces will leave in 2014 was something that further encouraged the Taliban, because they realized that time is on their side, and the Western forces will leave sooner or later. But at the same time, the Afghan security forces have received training, although they're not completely ready to take on the insurgency on their own. But they have made big strides. So there is a balance, I think, and starting tomorrow we will see how well the Afghan security forces can hold their ground. But no doubt that the Taliban will try to show that they have the upper hand once the US combat mission has ended.
All right, Mark, I want to go back to you on a point you were mentioning earlier about the role of foreign troops, particularly US troops. Now, what's been reported is that the US president quietly signed an authorization order. This was reported in November, allowing US troops to now engage in combat, when I say now, I mean in 2015, to engage in combat roles against the Taliban and other groups, Haqqani Network and so on, not just Al-Qaeda, that US troops will be able to engage in combat to defend US personnel in 2015. And they'll be able to engage in combat to defend the Afghan government in 2015. And US jets, bombers and drones, as well as troops, can be deployed in combat. So again, the question is, how different a role will foreign forces play in 2015? Will it just be, back to the usual order of things? Because those are pretty broad roles.
No, I would make two comments. First of all, I think it's an issue more of scale rather than capability. It's clear that if that order is correct, that what the president is saying is that you can effectively continue the same role that you've had for a number of years. You're just going to do it with far less troops than you've had in the years prior, and we're always going to let the Afghans take the lead. I think it also suggests the importance and the lessons that have been learned for what some would consider the abrupt withdrawal from Iraq in 2011, where there was a belief by this administration that you could hand over everything in its entirety to the Iraqi forces and they could do it by themselves. There are some lessons that were learned from that experience, as evidenced by the number of American troops coming back into Iraq. And I think this administration, in this case, has wisely made the decision that there needs to be more tapering rather than an abrupt withdrawal.
So hang on, Mike, what you're saying is basically the Obama administration is under pressure from the Pentagon. Is the Pentagon then really the party that is writing the end game, if not the game itself in Afghanistan now, rather than civilians in the Obama administration?
I don't think that's the case at all. I don't think it's they're under pressure, that the president's under pressure from the Pentagon. I think what the president has done is learn from the mistake made in 2011.
Let's move the discussion on to Helena. I want to ask you, when we listen there to what Mark Kimmett says about how the detail, the thing to keep your eye on might be more a question of scale than the type of role of US forces. I wonder whether you think Afghan officials and Afghan security personnel are seeing it that way. Just to give an example, let's quote here what the police chief of Wardak province said. He said, referring, of course, I should point out, to the reported authorization by the US president to keep US troops in combat in 2015, he said, "This is the decision we needed to hear. We could lose battles against the Taliban without direct support from American forces." Well, if it's a question of scale, Helena, do you think the Afghan officials are expecting the same scale and role?
The Afghan security forces now are about 370 some strong. So in terms of scale, they can hold the ground. But in terms of air support is something that the Afghan army doesn't have, and also all the surveillance, technology and things that until now the US and NATO troops were providing, the Afghan security forces don't have yet. As well as, of course, the sophistication of various arms and combat equipment that is necessary, but we shall see, because at least to me, the changing role is a little bit murky. I don't quite understand what will change and what will continue. We shall see how much involved the US and NATO will continue to be. And probably they will gradually give room to the Afghan security forces to take their place. But I think it's more a question of quality than quantity at this point that we are concerned about.
All right, let's bring in Haroon to the discussion. Let's talk a little more broadly about the sort of Afghanistan that Afghans will wake up to tomorrow. The US, of course, has spent, according to the Congressional Research Report, which I dug up here, $93 billion in assistance to Afghanistan, it says, since the fall of the Taliban, $56 billion of that going to help Afghan forces. After $93 billion, do you think Afghanistan is a better governed country today?
Well, we have to measure achievement in progress in Afghanistan in relative terms. We have to compare Afghanistan of today with the time of the Taliban or during the 1990s. I was a witness. I lived in Afghanistan during the 1990s and also during the Taliban time when I was an assistant to late Ahmad Shah Massoud, who was fighting against the Taliban. So in relative terms, our achievements are tremendous. Even looking at our security institutions, we have built a new security forces, either the Afghan National Army or police from the scratch, and nothing existed before. And we have now a professional army. The Afghan National Army is well respected by the Afghan people in general. They have been improving constantly, and they have proved since the beginning of this year in 2014 that they are capable. They have the capacity to defend the country.
Okay,
and also in terms of economy,
beyond
education for young generation.
The issue of the military and the army, though, if we take a measure of governance, of course, one of the measures is corruption. Let me just read a number to you here, Haroon. In 2007, Transparency International ranked Afghanistan at 172 out of 179 countries. And in 2014, the country's standing hasn't changed at all on the group's Corruption Perception Index. When it comes to corruption, that's something that Afghans have to face in everyday life, according to that piece of research. What's become better for people?
Exactly. Mistakes have been committed by both the Afghan government and the international community. I've been a strong critic of President Karzai, at least since 2006, and I have also criticized some of the US policies in Afghanistan. And I managed a number of development projects in Afghanistan, and I certainly raised the issue that there is a frenzy for big spending and rapid change from the international community, in particular from the United States, whereas we Afghans want gradual change with little money, and this is because we are a poor country. Certainly, and so this is the reason why President Ghani now wants to correct the mistakes committed in the past in order to improve governance and fight corruption, because corruption and bad governance is also affecting the Afghan security forces, because we are spending a lot of money and this budget is not sustainable by a very poor country. And also appointments and promotions within the rank and files of the Afghan security forces are certainly influenced by political decisions, and particularly the powerful power brokers have a say when it comes to appointments and promotions of senior security officials, and that has to stop. And President Ghani himself said that he will interview anyone who should be promoted to a rank of general before he signs on that. So that is certainly a change with the new government.
All right, so clearly Haroon feels there that some progress has been made, but challenges remain too. Mark Kimmett, how, from the US perspective, after spending $93 billion, how confident is the mood in Washington that any achievements will be preserved looking forward into the country? And the reason I ask that is from the same congressional research report, December the 2nd, 2014, it notes, and I quote here, Afghan stability is at risk from weak and corrupt Afghan governance. That doesn't sound like a lot of confidence, does it?
No, and I don't think there's a lot of cause for overconfidence here in Washington, D.C. I think we ought to be cautiously optimistic, but too much confidence, to my mind, would lead to too many calls for withdrawal. I believe that the United States needs to remain engaged in Afghanistan for the very reasons that you've mentioned up to this point. While some of the facts are very optimistic, some of them are quite pessimistic.
But Mark, if it remains engaged,
is not
with what sort of game plan, I mean, what kind of strategy could it remain engaged with to achieve something different that hasn't already been tried in the last 13 years?
The first thing, it needs to remain engaged with a military presence and a diplomatic presence on the ground, because I believe that if we had a total withdrawal of military forces and military support, it would feed into the Taliban narrative that the Americans and the West is running away from Afghanistan, and could in fact promote the very takeover or retakeover by the Taliban that they're so seeking to achieve.
Hasn't that already been tried in the last 13 years, a U.S. military and diplomatic presence? I mean, what more could the U.S. bring to the game in Afghanistan? What new?
Well, I'm not talking about bringing more to the game. I think America is war-weary and is not willing to devote new assets and new resources. What I'm suggesting is that the Americans can't just precipitously walk away as we did in Vietnam in 1975 or Iraq in 2011. There needs to be, a better example might be what happened in the Balkans. The Americans came across and NATO came across the Sava River in 1996 and has remained engaged in that part of Central Europe since that time period, perhaps not with American troops, but certainly with European Union troops. So it's a measure of staying engaged in the country, maintaining a presence, maintaining support, maintaining the financial resources that have been committed, so that there is not a precipitous withdrawal that only would benefit the enemy in their ability to give the Afghan people a view that the West has abandoned them and that the Taliban are inevitably going to return.
All right, Helena, if we look at some other indicators perhaps of governance, Afghanistan has made progress, has it not, when it comes to things like holding elections, work on a constitution? But can you say that Afghanistan is today a country of institutions rather than personalities? And just, you know, one thing comes to mind, how that presidential election dispute was resolved in the end. It was resolved through a personal deal being brokered by the US between Ashraf Ghani and Abdullah, rather than constitutional principles and courts and so on and so forth.
Well, it is true that a lot of the groundwork has been done to build institutions for the state of Afghanistan, but institutions alone cannot sustain a system, or especially a democratic system, you have to also work on the culture of, the political culture. And in that regard, unfortunately, the previous administration in Afghanistan did not do much. Not only that, but also at times worked against it.
But Helena, sorry, I'm not just talking about the previous administration. Forgive me for interrupting. It's not just a matter of the previous administration. I'm also looking to the future. Is a precedent being set going forward when you have the office being created for the personality? You know, Abdullah becomes chief executive officer rather than the personality being chosen to fit the office. This is a problem going forward, is it not?
Well, in a way, yes, but the Afghan elections this year were very challenging. There were a lot of hands that played in it, which I don't think now is the time to go into it in detail. But the only possible outcome after all the things that happened was some sort of a coming together of the two sides to form a government of national unity, as it is called. But you're right that this in a way works against the constitution, the institutions that were built. And now we have created an office for a personality, but we are going through a difficult transition, and the fact that 2014 was a year of both political transition and military transition, it made it harder. But I think these issues can be overcome.
I've got to mention a really important point, and that was one of the stated objectives for NATO forces in 2001 was the eradication of Afghanistan's biggest cash crop, opium. But far from going down, opium production is at now record levels. Afghanistan produces twice as much opium now as it did in 2000. In 2014, an estimated 6,400 tons of opium was produced, which is around 90% of the world's supply. And the UN estimates that the industry accounts for 15% of the Afghan economy. Haroon, very briefly, do you think the Afghan drug problem is going to get any better, is set up to improve going forward? Very briefly.
Well, not. Unfortunately, we won't be able to address this big challenge in the past policies, either by the British government or the US government failed in Afghanistan. And Afghan government now faces many challenges in fighting drug lords in Afghanistan and reducing poppy crop in Afghanistan might not be in the priority of the Afghan government right now, but hopefully with a consensus at the regional level, because this is not a fight alone by the Afghan government. We have to engage regional countries because drug transits through Afghanistan via these countries, and also we need to engage other stakeholders, for example, Europeans, United States, and others that are also suffering from Afghan drug, and there has to be a comprehensive regional policy to address this issue.
All right, Helena, I think we've got 60 seconds left. I know you were angling to get a word in there, so let me give you the last 60 seconds. Go ahead.
I wanted to say that, ironically, the Afghan people, after all the years of war and the past 13 years of a chance for peace, they are completely ready to move towards democratization and embrace the institutions and the rule of law. But unfortunately, the political elite at many times, but also the international community, the United States, they seem like they don't want this progress to happen, which is quite surprising.
All right, I know they say ladies first. We're going to make it ladies last as well in this show, and thank our guests. Since we're out of time here, let's thank Haroon Mir and Helena Malikyar in Kabul, and as well Mark Kimmett in Washington, D.C. And of course, let us know your thoughts. You can post your comments to us at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, or contact us on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. I'm Sami Zaidan. Thanks for watching, and for now, it's goodbye.